Yeah, Green Insight is a HERS Lead for Homes company. We've been in New Mexico for almost 12 years, and we do mostly multifamily, but a lot of single family and all types of homes. And we, about 4 years ago, opened an office in Fort Collins, Colorado, and that's where I moved to and where I currently reside. And the interesting thing about that is Fort Collins went through this transition about the time I moved there. So I've got a pretty good idea of what happens when this big code switch happens in a community. And so we'll talk about that, having some experience seeing it from the other side and having gone through this change, and it's pretty much stabilized now up at Fort Collins. So as Robin said, if you have any questions at any time, put them in the chat. Robin's going to be monitoring that, and that we'll get going. Crossing the Chasm, IECC 2009 to 2018. I wrote this practical English language guide to the code changes here in New Mexico. So this is the agenda for today. We're going to do this in two parts, and we'll have a break in between. So the first part is we're going to basically go through the guide of Crossing the Chasm, this 2008 to 2009 IECC to 2018, and we're going to talk about the major code changes and residential only today. There were a lot of commercial changes as well, but time constraints and just attention spans, we're not going to cover that today. And then we're briefly going to go over the thermal bypass inspection checklist that everybody's going to need to complete under the new code. And we're not going to go into that in great detail, but Santa Fe Community College has a free course on that, which is about 3.5 hours long. And we'll cover that today too, how to get hooked up with that. And then part two is really a lot of practical information. It's basically an excerpt of the most valuable information from my online course. I forgot to mention my other company is Air Sealing Authority, which provides online training for contractors, insulators, and architects in air sealing techniques. So part two is going to be some excerpts of the superintendent's course and really practical advice on how to air seal, what to look for, how to do it efficiently. And the 4 lessons we're going to go through are how much is too much, really short lesson. Something I call the fish tank trick, which hopefully you're intrigued by that. I'll leave you in suspense. We're going to look at the top 10 priority air sealing opportunities as I see them. And this is a great point for a conversation if other people see other ideas and we can share ideas. And then something I call the TTR method. And I'll leave that one to your imagination too. And then at the very end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Part 1 takes about an hour, more or less. Part 2 is more like a half an hour, 40 minutes. And then Q&A, I'll stay here as long as we need to answer all the questions. All right, so I mentioned before the learning opportunities with Santa Fe Community College. They've got the free thermal bypass class, and it's about a 3.5 hour class. The next one is June 30th, but I spoke with Amanda Hatherley there, and she says they're either going to schedule more of them or they're going to record that one and put it up on their website for free viewing, sort of at your own pace type of training. And then there's another training they're putting on, which is how to become a certified air and duct leakage tester. And that's about an 8.5 hour course. It's at your own pace, so you can do it as you want. And that one's free also. And there's information on there to sign up for that. And we'll have Robin email out the links for those trainings after this. All right. Here's my contact information if you need it. My 2 email addresses for Air Sealing Authority and Green Insight. And I'll have this up at the break too and at the end. All right, so moving on to part 1, Crossing the Chasm. As I said, this guide is a downloadable guide. It covers the major energy code changes. It's about 20 pages, and I try to make it as plain English as possible because I don't know about you, but building code is the nails on the chalkboard of the building industry for me. I hear code and it's like, ugh. It's just terrible to read the way it's written. And so I really wanted to get out a plain English guide that everybody could understand and read. And so there's the website, airsailingacademy.com/f/crossing the chasm with some hyphens in there. It's free download. It's not, you'll be on a list, but I'm not going to sell you anything or that. Well, what I want people on the list for is to send them updates. I'm trying to keep up with as local jurisdictions adopt changes to the code, amendments and modifications, pushing those out through that list. So it's good to be on that list, and there's probably some other information that I'll be emailing out to that list as well. All right, so what's the big change? This is a graph of the code changes since the 1980s, and you can see there's a couple of big jumps in there, and we're doing the biggest jump possible. IECC 2009 to 2012 was a big jump, and that's where the air sealing requirements came in, the testing requirements, and since then, towards 2018, it's bumped down incrementally, and so going from 2009 to 2018 really is a chasm. It's a big jump. So everybody needs to really pay attention and probably change the way they're doing things, sometimes significantly. So this applies now. It started if you permitted after March 1st in Albuquerque and after March 25th in the rest of the state. And where does it apply? So it applies statewide, but there's some modifications in 6 counties. So the air tightness testing is only required in 6 counties, our 6 most populous counties. And those are on the map there. And the requirement in the IECC 2018 is 3 air changes per hour, which is pretty tight. The state loosened that to 4 air changes per hour for these 6 counties. But you have to keep in mind that local jurisdictions can adopt something more strict. And in fact, Albuquerque did. They adopted the IECC 2018 without any amendments. So none of the state amendments apply to Albuquerque City. And we'll be covering that a little bit too. So the new code has 5 compliance pathways. 2009 had 3 compliance pathways. So we've got 2 new ones to look at. And these are the 6. You've got the prescriptive, which is basically, your basic do this and you pass code. Then you've got the prescriptive with the total U-value alternative. And that's one where you can do some trade-offs with the envelope. And I'm going to go into each one of these in detail in a bit. And then simulated performance, which is a computer-generated energy model. And then the new one is the energy rating index, which if you're familiar with the HERS index, very similar. Also a computer-generated model. And then there's new above code programs, so alternatives. The ones that are specifically mentioned in the New Mexico code are Lead for Homes and Build Green New Mexico. But it also says that local jurisdictions can look at other programs that are above code. And that's an interesting option. So we'll start with the prescriptive pathway. And this is what the prescriptive pathway is. You do everything in sections R401 through R404. It's very simple, but not at all flexible. So 401, it says 410 there, it should be 401. That's just a general section of permitting and fees and that type of thing. And then there's the building thermal envelope section, which is where your air sealing requirements come in. There's a system section where applies to HVAC and water heating, that type of thing. A lot of technical details in that one. And then electrical power and lighting systems is the last one. And you basically have to do everything is mandatory. Main table in that section is the insulation and fenestration table. So this tells you all your R values for your walls and your ceilings and what your windows have to be. And so we've got the 2018 in red, 2009 in black. So you can see most everything changed. There's a few things that did not change, and almost everything got stricter. So here in Albuquerque, we're in climate zone 4. So we're looking at, going from a U-value windows to a 0.35 to 0.32, which honestly is not that big of a deal. Those windows are widely available and not any more expensive really than a 0.35. is what I'm hearing from builders in Colorado. Ceiling R value, here I know we got people from all climate zones on the call, so I won't go through them all though, because that'll take too much time. So here in Albuquerque, your ceilings went from R38 to R49, and R49 is the max everywhere now. And your walls, both in climate zones 3 and 4, pretty much 3, 4, and 5, all climate zones are the same now. They have to be R20, so you got to have a 2x6 wall, or you can do R13, a 2x4 wall, plus R5 rigid on the exterior. Those are your options now. And that's throughout the state. And then we've got some other ones. Basement wall, slab, edge insulation didn't change at all. There's some changes for crawl spaces in climate zone 5. But that's the idea of that table. There's some serious changes. And probably the biggest and the most problematic change in the code is the air leakage requirements. Looking on this table, statewide, previously you were only required to do a visual inspection. Air leakage test is not required. That's the same statewide, but if you're in one of those 6 counties, you have to do the visual inspection, which is the thermal bypass checklist. We'll go over that in the next part. But you also have to meet that 4 air changes per hour requirement. And that's if you're working multifamily and you've got a small apartment, that's a little tougher to do. The smaller the envelope, the smaller the volume, the more difficult these air sealing requirements are to achieve. And of course, Albuquerque, you have to do the visual inspection and meet 3 air changes per hour tested. And if you're doing multifamily and you've got a 500-600 square foot studio apartment, you're going to have a tough time. I can guarantee you right now. And I know this because in Fort Collins, there's a lot of multifamily building going on up there, and they actually ended up changing their code. They made an amendment to where multifamily was based on square feet of building envelope. So it was allowed 0.3 CFM per square foot of building envelope, which on a small apartment works out to about between 4 or 4.5 ACH. So they loosen the requirement because every building has a certain amount of holes, no matter what the size. You've got a kitchen fan vent, you've got a bath fan vent, and a dryer vent typically. And those are, whether you've got a large house or a small apartment, those holes are there, and it just eats up a lot of your allowance for air leakage. So duct leakage. There's a lot of exceptions in the new law, but I'll just go over these requirements and how much they've changed. So you can do your test at rough-in or post-construction, and you can do it at rough-in with the air handler installed or with the air handler not installed. And so again, in red, we've got the new requirements, and you can see they're significantly tighter, and especially when you're doing a post-construction test. So the maximum you're ever allowed is 4 CFM per square foot per 100 square foot of conditioned floor area, which is pretty tight. You're going to be required to keep your ducts pretty tight, but they've built in some exceptions. And let's go over those now. So the first is if all your ducts and air handler are within conditioned space, you don't need to test. And really, this is my recommendations, a lot of people's recommendation, just do this. I know that can be hard sometimes. You need to get them in the attic, but if there's any way possible to bring your ducts into conditioned space, it's a great idea, and you will be exempt from testing. Any duct serving a dedicated outdoor air system like an HRV or an ERV that's not connected to your HVAC system, a lot of time you've got the air intake that goes into the HVAC return. If you're doing that type of system, that whole duct system is considered part of the HVAC system and needs to be tested as well. So you need to keep those really tight, unless it's all within conditioned space. Or, and this is the third one, is the biggie. This is the killer. This is the get out of jail free card. If you follow the verification checklist, and it can be verified by the builder, by the code official, or by an energy rater. And this applies everywhere except Albuquerque, because this is a statewide exception. This is not in the IECC 2018. which was adopted by Albuquerque without any amendments. This is a state amendment. So in Albuquerque, you're testing your ducts. Just remember that. In the city of Albuquerque. But you also have to do this visual verification. And we'll go over that checklist too right now, in fact. It's a very short checklist. It's 4 items, and they're just wanting to make sure that you're sealing up as best you can. And honestly, sealing ducts is not that difficult. It's really about the connections. Mostly we see weaknesses in the connections from the return to the HVAC to the supply plenum, and then all the takeoffs, and then sealing duct boots to drywall. If you're doing hard ducts, you need to make sure all your seams are sealed, and it's really pretty straightforward and not that difficult. We see some other problems with people applying mastic. It's, you're supposed to paint it on there pretty thick along the seams and connections, and we see people painting on there like it's watercolor and just barely a stripe on there and super thin. But you need to put it on thick, and what we tell people is thick as a nickel is pretty much how you should be covering your seams, and that'll be pretty bomb proof, and through time, heating and cooling cycles, it'll last. I'm not going to go over this checklist in detail. It's pretty straightforward. Yes, we have a question.
Yes, Ryan, there's a question, and I just wanted to verify that every builder is required to do the visual duct inspection throughout the state.
That's not super clear in the code. It's very clear you have to do the thermal bypass inspection. I think you only have to do the duct inspection checklist if you're looking for the exemption. If you're doing the testing, I don't think you have to also do the checklist.
All right, but the exception would be the city of Albuquerque, where they.
City of Albuquerque, you're always testing.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't think you need to also do the visual inspection checklist. All right, so the question is, who can do this testing? And the code says any third party trained in the testing protocol. So if you take this course at Santa Fe Community College, this 8.5-hour course that we talked about earlier, you are qualified to do the testing. Is this a great idea? I mean, I could test everyone in this room, everyone in this call in an afternoon, how to properly run a blower door test, do a duct blaster test, and get a valid result. But what I see as the potential problem here is we're going to get people that are go through this course, know how to do this, and they're going to test for a builder. It's going to fail. The builder is going to say, well, why did I fail? And the tester is going to say, well, I don't know. You figure it out. So my experience is you want somebody that's somewhat experienced doing your testing. And the people that are taking the course, maybe they have experience in construction, they're good at air sealing already, and they'll know what you missed and what you didn't miss. And hopefully they're inspecting mid-construction also. That's really a key point, is this thermal bypass checklist. If you're not really adept at it and don't have a lot of experience, it's kind of hard to interpret. And another reason why I highly recommend you go through this course with Santa Fe Community College on that checklist. I've got 10 years of experience or more of doing thermal bypass inspections, and I'm still learning things, still finding different things. So it's not the easiest scope of work. And the truth is, you pass the blower door test mid-construction. You pass that air leakage test by what you do mid-construction before everything is enclosed. So if you don't take care of it at that point, you fail at the end, it's an issue. And we call it sometimes death by 1,000 cuts, where there's no huge hole that we can find. It's just a lot of little holes everywhere, and you spend days trying to air seal and fix that. So how it worked in Fort Collins was they put this in, and they're pretty much the same as the code officials here in town, saying, yes, we're going to enforce this. There's no exceptions. If you fail, you've got to go back and fix it until you pass. And Fort Collins was very much the same hard line when they put this code in place. And as the great boxer Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. And Fort Collins got punched in the face, and builders were failing left and right, not knowing what to do. And they changed the code to institute a policy of, they basically gave every builder a mulligan. So they said, you can have one failure, we'll give you a variance on that, but you have to do better next time. And they also provided a lot of trainings similar to this one. Asked that they didn't require the builders to attend those, but they asked that they do, and most of them did. And now, 3 years on, everybody's pretty much passing at 3 air changes per hour, and it's not a big deal. And nobody's complaining about it. I recently had a builder that didn't pass, and it was a problem. I'll tell that story in a little bit, though. It was kind of, I would call it catastrophic, but it was a big problem. All right, so just to emphasize again, we have these learning opportunities. Please take advantage. You don't have to become an air tester, but you definitely want to take the thermal bypass class, because that's really good information. All right, so there's a whole lot in the prescriptive pathway that we don't have time to cover today, and the things that you should be aware of, and these might be things that you have in your building, maybe you don't. So vapor retarders, and I'm not even going to read the whole list because it's a long list. Steel frame construction, sunrooms, glazing, fireplaces, programmable thermostats, temperature setbacks for hot water, duct insulation, solar hot water systems, hot water pipe insulation, equipment sizing, pools and spas, lighting. So a ton of stuff that is in there, and it is covered in my guide, the downloadable guide. So if you read that, you'll be up on it. So the second pathway to code compliance is called the prescriptive with total UA alternative, and UA is overall U value for the home. So there's some more options here. You still have to do all those items in sections 401 through 404, but there's some trade-offs. You can design a better thermal envelope than you would get from just the prescriptive requirements. And you only have to beat that envelope by 0.5%, so just barely. So if you want to put more insulation in the attic, you can do a little worse windows. If you're doing better windows, you can do a little less in the attic or a little less in the walls, or some trade-off like that. But it has to be within reason. You can't put in bomber windows and R57 walls and have zero insulation. So there are some backstops with that, with your trade-offs. You can't go crazy. And most of those are IECC 2009 requirements. So they're the past code. So it's what you're used to doing. Don't do any worse than what you're used to doing, and you should be fine. And it's really easy to show compliance for this pathway. I think it's one of the best alternatives to code compliance, excuse me. And you use what's called res check, and there's a web-based version and there's a desktop version. If you do it a lot, you might want to consider the desktop version, and so you can keep all your files on your computer as opposed to on the web. It's a really simple interface. You're basically entering in the areas and R values and U values for walls, doors, windows, ceilings, slab edge insulation, that type of thing. And then it'll tell you what your compliance is or not. And if you need to adjust, you adjust your building. And obviously this should be done design stage, and you need to turn this in for permit anyway. So that is that one. Pretty straightforward. The third compliance pathway, which was in 2009, is called simulated performance. And it's a computer generated model, and there's a $sign there because what this looks at, basically you take the home that you're building is compared to a fictitious reference home, which is the same square footage, same climate zone, everything, but it's built to the prescriptive code. So it takes all the prescriptive requirements, puts them in that reference home, and then compares the home you're building to that. And your utility bills need to be less than they would be in that prescriptive built home, that reference home. So it's pretty straightforward, but it takes somebody trained in computer modeling for this, and typically that's going to be a HERS rater. They'll know what to do. It's very similar to a HERS rating. It is the same software you use, but it's just a different report that's generated. So again, you have to do the mandatory items, sections 401 through 404. And again, in the Crossing the Chasm guide, there's at the very end, there's an appendix with all those mandatory requirements. So it's pretty straightforward at a glance look at what those are. It's not everything in those sections. There's certain things that are mandatory, certain that are optional. And then you have to do everything in section R405, which is the requirements for that computer model. Like I said, it's a HERS software, but it's not a HERS rating. There's a difference there. And it's really similar to that past, the prescriptive with total U-value alternative that we talked about previously, because it compares the design home to that prescriptive built home, except there's a lot more opportunities for trade-offs. So this one includes HVAC and the water heating and appliances. You can basically trade off anything in the home that consumes energy. And there are some disadvantages, and mainly is the cost to hire someone to do this modeling. And typically there are some advantages too in hiring somebody. Typically they'll come out and verify what's in the design, and they'll do the testing as well. That is that one. Then we've got the energy rating index, the fourth path. This is a new one. This is even more similar to a HERS rating because it's also an index from 0 to 100. In 2016, when this first came out, it was equivalent to a HERS rating. But when this got put in the code, it referenced that specific version of the HERS rating, the 2016 version, what was in the standard then, and it hasn't changed. Meanwhile, the HERS rating has been updated. It includes more things, and it's changed. It's evolved over the last 5 years. So they're no longer equivalent. But again, you're doing these 4 sections again, plus everything in section 406, which is the ERI requirements. Again, it's an energy model. Again, you're using HERS software, closer to a HERS rating, but some different parameters in that ERI. And like I said, the HERS rating has since evolved. It's not equivalent anymore. And there are some ventilation differences in the way the ERI is calculated. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but just something to be aware of. It favors a balanced ventilation. Will get you more points than exhaust only or supply only ventilation strategy. So again, this same amount of opportunity for trade-offs in this pathway, but everywhere we've looked, the simulated performance path is easier to pass than the ERI. We look at a lot of homes that are sort of on the bubble, and we find they're passing with simulated performance and not passing with ERI pretty consistently almost everywhere. And again, it depends a little bit on their ventilation strategy. So if we've got an ERV or HRV in there that's super efficient, they'll probably pass the ERI too. But again, that depends on the home and climate zone. So for this pathway, you've got in each climate zone, there's a max ERI that you're allowed. And for New Mexico, it's either 57 or 62 here in Albuquerque, or 61. Well, really, we've got some climate zone 7 and 8 too up in the Taos and Angel Fire areas. So the ski areas are at that higher elevation, higher climate zone. So like I said, if you're hiring a HERS rater to do this, have them look at both the simulated performance and the ERI, and I can almost guarantee you that simulated performance is going to be the route you're going to choose for code compliance if you're going with one of those two. And it's really easy for a HERS rater to look at both reports and just tell you which one is better. And if you're really interested in the details of the differences between those two, you can look on my guide, and Appendix A goes into detail on that. All right, so our fifth and final code compliance pathway is above code programs. And there's two that are written into the code, LEED for homes from the USGBC and Build Green New Mexico. But the code also mentions that it's open to local jurisdictions to adopt other above code programs and allow those. So some key points. If you go the above code path, it doesn't require all those mandatory requirements, those 401 through 404 be met. And again, you can see a list of those in the guide. But this is kind of a big deal to not have to meet all those requirements. However, most of these above code programs require very similar, if not the same requirements. So it's not a completely get out of jail free card, but you do skip some of those onerous requirements in those sections. So this is something to look at. Doesn't work in Albuquerque. Albuquerque does not adopt that amendment of exempting those 4 sections. So even if you do above code program in Albuquerque, you still have to meet our 401 through 404. But like I say, most above code programs include those requirements or something similar. And there's some other things that are really important if you're considering this pathway. And mostly you'll be considering this pathway in New Mexico if you're going for the sustainable building tax credit, where one of these programs is required to obtain that. First of all, you need to check with your local code official to see if they're on board with accepting this as a code compliance pathway, because it's written in the code as an option. It's not necessarily mandatory, and in a lot of ways, the building code is what the official says it is, not necessarily what's written down. So always check with your local code official before you permit. Another thing to know is Build Green New Mexico does not permit multifamily buildings and does not certify multifamily buildings. So that program's out if you're doing multifamily for code. And LEED for homes has a disadvantage, and it can take a long time to get your certification. Build Green New Mexico has done a really great job of getting the certifications out and turned around really quickly. USGBC, the LEED for Homes program requires a lot more documentation, and they're a lot more bureaucratic and require a little more time and attention to all the different credits, and so it takes some time to get certified, and if you need that for your C of O, then it could be an issue. And we haven't really explored this yet, but it's willing. We're willing to, and hopefully we can have code officials accept a letter from a LEED for Homes provider saying the project has been submitted for certification and we expect it to certify, and they can give the certificate of occupancy based on that, because it could take up to a month or some cases even longer to get that certification finalized. So some additional resources, these are in the guide, but you can look these up also. There's 2 sites, the New Mexico Home Builders Association and the Construction Industries Division both have lists of all New Mexico building codes, and those are up to date. And like I said, they're kind of hard to read because they reference the 2018 and different sections and numbers and everything and go back and forth. It's kind of a pain. And then there's a link to the New Mexico Residential Energy Code. I know I don't have the websites written down in here, but maybe we can send those out, Robin. And if you download the guide, they're in there. And everybody should know that the IECC 2018 is free for viewing online to anybody. And there's 2 checklists. If you're in the room, they're on the back table: the thermal bypass inspection checklist and the duct sealing visual inspection checklist. And Robin, I think you emailed those out already, right? Okay. So hopefully everybody has those to reference. And then there's the New Mexico Commercial Energy Code, which we're not covering today, but again, a lot of big changes in that one as well if you do commercial. And if you do any mixed use buildings, the code specifically says dwelling units are subject to the residential requirements. Anything that's not a dwelling unit is subject to the commercial requirements. So that means your common areas, your hallways, your gyms, your community amenities, your office space, if you have any retail in the building, anything like that is subject to the commercial part of the code. So keep that in mind. That's I think a little bit different than the 2009 had it. So a quick check for questions, Robin. Do we have any?
Performance requirement. Do we still have to abide by sections 401 and 404? If we're using the performance method, not prescriptive. We still have to do that?
But only the mandatory requirements within that, not everything. And there's about probably half of that. The prescriptive half is mandatory.
Okay. Certificate of occupancy. Is it tied to the certification of, if you're not doing USGBC lead for homes, like Belgrade, New Mexico, because,
It's not clear.
that's
Talk to you.
stupid because it's not having to do with life or safety.
I agree.
And it could potentially cost us a lot of money because the mortgage rate is locked in over a 30-year period. If the mortgage rate, that's like government overreach to me.
Yeah, it's a great alternative to have in the code, but that's the weakness of it, really, is, and that's why we'd like to explore whether the building official would accept a letter saying this has been submitted for certification and we expect it to be certified, and allow the C of O to go out based on that. But I think it's going to depend on the code officials and their call. Because it's definitely open to interpretation. There's nothing specific in the code about that.
Okay, I think that's the only question I have.
Thank you. At this moment, are there any questions from those who are attending via Zoom? You can unmute yourself to ask those questions, or you can put them in the chat. We'll make sure that we answer all your questions as well.
It seems like that change in the prescriptive method is the R49 on the ceiling. We're R38 now, correct? So if we are doing air sealing with spray foam insulation and then R19, will that pass? Because that's based on a performance method. Because the spray foam insulation is much better than the bat insulation.
It still needs to equal R49. So if your spray foam is R30, then yes, if you're doing the prescriptive pass,
Yeah, spray foam and R19 is about R40.
Yeah.
So it's still, but you're only talking about prescriptive method. If we're doing performance-based method, it doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter. You can trade that off.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thank you. We have trade-offs there.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're doing better windows or better HVAC or better hot water heating, you can trade off a bunch of things and go a little lower in your ceiling insulation. That's fine. And if you're doing, that the spray foam might bring your air changes down below the requirement, and that's another trade-off where you gain some there. They're not totally different. They're the same exact entries for everything, and same with simulated performance, which is why they all use the same software. It's just the calculation that comes out at the end. So the HERS rating now includes credits for all LED lighting. The ERA doesn't have that because it's pegged to the 2016 version of the HERS, and they've since added credits for that. They've added, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head all the changes that have happened to a HERS rating since 2016, but LED lighting is one. I think there's been some other ventilation credits. The calculation has changed for that a little bit. There's probably other people on the call that know better than I do off the top of my head what those changes are. But yeah, that's the difference in how those are calculated. It's just that a HERS rating has been updated as, building science has evolved. So that was it for part 1A, all the code changes. That's the hard part. Now we're just going to go through the thermal bypass inspection checklist, and we're going to do this quickly. We're not going to go in depth because you can take that course from Santa Fe Community College and really get to know this really well. So this is more of just a tour of the checklist and we'll cover a few things here and there. And it consists of 6 sections. So the first one is the overall air barrier and thermal barrier alignment. Then walls joining exterior walls or unconditioned spaces, floors between conditioned and exterior spaces, shafts, which is kind of a catch-all category, attic ceiling interface, and common walls between dwelling units. So again, want to make sure you take advantage of this free course. Again, it's free. Hopefully when it's recorded, it'll be an at your own pace thing, so you can watch it 10 minutes at a time. Don't have to sit there for 3.5 hours and go through it all. But the June 30th one is live, and you can sign up for that one. So this is what the state version of the checklist looks like. You are allowed to use, and this is how it's written in the code, thermal bypass certification or checklist from a HERS rater. Nobody knows what that means. It sounds like a HERS rater can just make up their own checklist and you go through that and pass. So I wouldn't trust that one. I would go for either this official state checklist. You can use the Bill Green New Mexico has a thermal bypass checklist within their program. So if you're already doing that program, you're already going to be compliant. The difference with Bill Green New Mexico is not everything is mandatory, but now for state code it is mandatory. You can use the Energy Star checklist, and it's written in the code as the Energy Star program checklist from New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. And they may be talking about the state form that we're going to go through. That's one page. The actual Energy Star Rater verification checklist is, I think it's called a Rater Field checklist, is 2 pages long. It's much more detailed than the state one we're going to go through. So really, I think this state form is probably your path of least resistance. Unless you're already doing Bill Green New Mexico, then you would just use that checklist. So the first section, and again, I'm not going to go into every single point on these because it's boring, it's excruciating, and it's, as written, it's not very clear. But just an overview of what this checklist contains. You've got these 4 columns, and the completed checklist, you need to have a yes somewhere in each row for these. There's a corrections needed, there's a builder verified, there's a rater verified, and there's a not applicable column. And you can mix, it doesn't all have to be builder verified or rater verified, it can be a mix. There's no real rules. If you're doing Energy Star, the builder can only verify, I think, 6 items on the checklist. But this state form doesn't appear to have any of those requirements. It can all be builder verified. Typically, if you're using a third party, a HERS rater or whoever to do this checklist, on the first pass, they may have some things checked as corrections needed. That's very common. And then you just need to correct those, and then you get a final rater verified checklist in the end. And then at the top of each section, you've got the sort of general requirements for that section. And then you've got the numbered detailed requirements that are there. And so each section is formatted exactly this way. And for this section, there's one thing I want to point out, that insulation shall be installed in full contact with sealed interior and exterior air barrier. Sealed interior and exterior air barrier is the key there. And we're going to talk about that in one of the modules when we talk about the top 10 air sealing opportunities. We're going to go into some detail on that, what that means. Because right now I don't see many builders at all doing sealing their exterior air barrier at all. And it's a challenge. So basically this whole section is looking at your insulation being in contact with an air barrier on all 6 sides. And a little bit about slab edge insulation and how that should be installed. The next section is talking about walls that adjoin exterior walls, or unconditioned spaces. One of the main things here I want to point out is they want you to have a continuous top plate, and sometimes a top plate is replaced with blocking, which is fine, but that blocking needs to be sealed on this checklist. Walls behind showers and tubs is also an important one. A lot of times you just got that shower surround up against the studs, and your insulation is there with big airspace. That's a no-no now. You need to put an air barrier in there. And most programs require some sort of moisture resistant, mold resistant gyp or other material in those places. And there's other places that are important that we'll talk about later too. Attic knee walls are a really important one because if you think about it, and skylight shaft walls are the same thing. An attic can be extremely hot in the summer. It can be 90 degrees outside and 120, 140 in an attic. And so those attic knee walls, a lot of times they don't have an air barrier on the backside, and they're just reduces the effectiveness of the insulation by quite a bit. And when you've got that extreme temperature difference between a conditioned space and 120, 140 degree attic, you really need those walls to be better than an exterior wall even. So and most often they are not. And it talks about staircase walls and some other things in that section too. The third section is floors between conditioned and exterior spaces, and this is basically frame floors above a garage or a cantilever floor that is over open air. And again, you need that. You need to have your insulation touching the floor above in order to make that work. That's really what they want. So assume you have a floor over a garage. You need to put your insulation in contact with the floor above, or fill that whole space, that whole truss space. Those are your two options. And same with the cantilever floor that's over open space. All right, and section 4 is shafts, and like I said, this is kind of a catch-all. They've got this little wording here: any remaining gaps, and that's their catch-all. So any duct shafts need to be sealed, piping penetrations, flue shafts. This is also wires going here, any holes that are wires that are going through your top plates. And basically, any hole of the exterior is technically covered by this, but not explicitly. And we'll go into those again in the second part of the talk today. And section 5, attic ceiling interface. This is a really important one. You need to make sure you've got a really tight air barrier on your ceilings. And it talks about attic access panels and making sure that those are insulated to the same level as your attic. So if you've got an attic access panel, you need to have that at R49 if you're in Albuquerque, or 38 down south. Same with attic drop down stairs, and there's some products out there that make that easy. One called Batic Door, which is basically a foam enclosure for your drop down stair that has a bat on the top, and you can get them in different sizes. And R49 is definitely available. Recessed lighting fixtures are in there. Whole house fans are in there, making sure those are there. And the main thing is it says air barrier is fully gasketed. And that goes for your access panels, your drop down stairs, all your can lights, so that there's no leakage between your conditioned air and your attic. And that's whether your attic is vented or unvented. It doesn't make a distinction there. If you've got a sealed attic, that's a little different. If it's semi-conditioned, that's a little different. All right, section 6, common walls between dwelling units. This one we find in multifamily and townhomes is a big deal for air sealing. A lot of people mess up this detail. You've got a double wall or some sort of fire rated wall with double gyp board sandwiched in between. And it can be difficult to air seal that all the way around, you know, from the roof to the ground, and just making sure that whole connection is sealed. And typically spray foam is the best alternative for that, you know, whether it's a can or other method of doing that. Caulk sometimes works. Sometimes the gap is large enough, you have to put a piece of plywood in there, or OSB, or you know, another stud. Sometimes the fire rating doesn't allow that, and it can be challenging. So keep that in mind. And so that does it with part one, which is the boring, hard part of code. And hopefully part two, we'll get into more practical strategies, what to seal, what not to seal. Again, my fish tank trick, the top priority air sealing opportunities, which is probably what everybody's most interested in right now, and something I call the TTR method. And then we'll do the Q&A. So like I promised, we're going to do a little break right now.